The tent was silent except for the rumble of thunder outside. Heavy incense curled through the air, masking the stench of fear that lingered in the silk-lined chamber. On the cushions lay the most feared man in history, Genghis Khan, his eyes half closed, his breath slow and confident. To him, this night was no different from thousands before. But to the young woman at his side, it was everything. Her hand trembled beneath the sheets, brushing against the hidden blade she had smuggled. She was a Tangut princess, a daughter of royalty, and the last survivor of a family the Khan himself had destroyed. Her mother had leaped from palace walls to escape capture. Her brothers' heads had been displayed on spears. She had endured years of captivity, degradation, and humiliation, and tonight she would endure no more. As lightning split the sky, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply. For 3 years she had waited for this moment, every night rehearsing the movement, every dawn remembering the screams of her people. Tonight, the conqueror who had claimed thousands of women would finally discover that conquest comes with consequences. But to understand why this night had arrived, why this woman's hand clutched steel with such resolve, we must step back. Decades earlier, long before he became the great Khan, the young man called Temujin had endured a wound that never healed. A wound carved not into his flesh, but into his soul. In 1184, Temujin was not yet the terror of nations. He was a struggling tribal leader, desperate to protect his new bride. They had married as teenagers. Their union meant to stabilize alliances among Mongol clans. But fate had other plans. One morning, at dawn, 30 Merkit raiders swept through their camp. Temujin fled on horseback, his only thought survival, while his wife was dragged, screaming, into captivity. For 8 endless months, Bort lived as the possession of another man. History's records grow vague here, smoothing over the agony, but the truth lies in what came after. When Temujin finally rescued her with the help of his blood brother Jamuka, Bort was heavily pregnant. The child she carried, Joki, was branded with uncertainty. Was he Temujin's son, or his enemy's? Even his name betrayed the doubt, Joki, meaning guest. Forever marking him as an outsider, Temujin claimed the boy, but the wound festered inside him. His honor was shattered, his wife's dignity broken, and his people knew it. In Mongol culture, a woman who had been taken by enemies carried shame that could never be erased. Every sideways glance, every whisper, every question about Joki's paternity was a knife in Temujin's pride. That wound reshaped him. The man who once fled on horseback swore never to run again. His vengeance was merciless. The Merkits who had taken Bort did not just die in battle, their entire tribe, women, children, the elderly, were wiped out. And still, it wasn't enough. For Temujin, revenge meant more than blood. It meant shame for shame, humiliation for humiliation. And so, one man's private agony transformed into a weapon of empire. Sexual violence would no longer be random brutality. It would become policy. Every conquered tribe would pay the price of Borte's abduction. Every woman taken would stand as a symbol of Temujin's rage against the world. It began with one kidnapping. It would end with an empire built on suffering. And years later, in a stormlit tent, it would end with a princess and her hidden blade, Temujin, the man the world would soon call. Genghis Khan was no longer just a wounded husband, he was becoming something far more dangerous. A man who turned his pain into law. Borte's abduction had broken him in ways no sword ever could. He had rescued her body, but not her honor. And in the harsh world of the steppes, honor meant everything. Every time Temujin looked at Joki, the boy who might not be his son, he was reminded of 8 long months of shame. Every time his men looked at him, he imagined they remembered that he had fled while his wife was taken. The wound throbbed in silence, and his answer was to make the entire world bleed with him. The Merkits were only the beginning. Temujin's revenge spread outward, tribe by tribe, city by city, and his vengeance took a specific form. Death alone wasn't enough. Killing enemies did not erase humiliation, but making them suffer as Bort had suffered, that balanced the scales. Women became more than spoils of war. They became weapons. tools of psychological terror, proof to enemies that their bloodlines, their legacies, their futures could be erased. When Mongol warriors stormed a city, the slaughter of men was only the first act. What followed was far worse. Temujin developed a philosophy that turned sexual violence into statecraft. To him, conquest meant more than capturing land. It meant possessing its women, bending entire bloodlines to his will. Every enemy woman who carried a Mongol child was one less future for her people. Every forced pregnancy was a victory, every womb another battlefield. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't random brutality. It was organized, deliberate, and terrifyingly efficient. The Mongols built a system for a bureaucracy of exploitation. After each conquest, women were gathered in open squares. Officials evaluated them as if they were livestock. Beauty, age, virginity, noble birth, each detail was scored and written into ledgers. A virgin princess might score 95 out of 100. A widow of a merchant, perhaps 60. Those who scored highest over 90 were sent directly to the Khan himself. The next tier went to his most trusted generals. Below them, officers, and at the bottom, common soldiers. Women who failed to meet the minimum standard, those who scored below 60, were not spared. They were sent to the military brothels. That followed Mongol armies, where survival often meant serving dozens of men each day until their bodies gave out. It was rape industrialized, a sexual economy where women were currency, traded and distributed with the same precision as food, horses, and weapons. 1. Chinese chronicler described the scene with trembling words. Women standing naked while officials circled with scratching numbers onto wooden boards, reducing human beings to mathematical values. The system was so efficient that even the horrors had ledgers. Mongol administrators kept records of who was sent where, which women were pregnant, and which had died. Some of these documents still exist. It's called bureaucratic inventories of human suffering. For Genghis Khan, this was balance. His private humiliation was now inflicted on entire nations. His personal wound had become policy. His shame became the empire's weapon. The man who once failed to protect one woman would now claim thousands. And in doing so, he institutionalized his trauma, building an empire on the foundation of organized suffering. The year was 1202. The Mongols had crushed the Tatar Confederation, their sworn enemies. But for Genghis Khan, military victory wasn't enough. The Tatars had poisoned his father years earlier. That wound still burned, and now he would repay it not with a battle, but with annihilation. His orders were chilling in their precision. Execute every Tatar male taller than a wagon axle. 3 feet, that was the measure of survival. Men and boys tall enough to remember their heritage, tall enough to carry on the bloodline, were slaughtered without hesitation. Infants and very young boys were spared, but only because they were small enough to be molded into Mongols, raised to forget they had ever been Tatars. The women, however, were destined for something far worse. They were distributed among Mongol troops as spoils, but not randomly. Sympathetically, elite warriors claimed the youngest and most beautiful. Common soldiers received the older and weaker. Families were torn apart. Mothers ripped from daughters. Sisters separated forever. And all of it carried out with military discipline, not drunken chaos. Witnesses described scenes that still echo in historical memory. Tatar women forced to watch their husbands executed, only to be handed over to their killers moments later. Daughters dragged away, while their mothers screamed until their voices broke. The Mongols understood that the deepest wounds came from isolation, breaking not only bodies, but the bonds of family, tribe, and culture. This was conquest through the womb. Genghis Khan didn't just want to destroy the Tatars. He wanted their bloodline erased, absorbed, digested into Mongol flesh. Every Tatar woman forced to bear a Mongol child was one less Tatar generation. Every Mongol son born from their bodies was proof of total domination. The logistics were horrifying in their detail. Pregnant women were marked and monitored. Guards watched them day and night to prevent suicide. Those who resisted faced brutal public punishment. their suffering made into a warning to others. Even death was denied, as in escape women were bound at night, their hands tied, their movements watched. The empire could not afford lost property, and yet the Tatars fought back in the only way left to them. Some leaped from cliffs into rivers, others starved themselves, praying for release. But the Mongols responded with ruthless control. The womb itself had become state property. Life and death no longer belonged to the women, it belonged to the empire. The screams of that first night carried for miles across the steppe. Thousands of voices rose in pain, grief, and rage. By dawn, an entire people had been violated. What the Mongols did to the Tatars was more than brutality, was innovation. Earlier conquerors had enslaved or killed their enemies. Genghis Khan did something new. He invented biological absorption, using systematic rape as a weapon of genocide. And it worked. Within a single generation, the Tatar identity disappeared. Their culture dissolved. Their children born of Mongol fathers grew up speaking Mongol tongues, trained to serve the empire, raised to destroy what little remained of their mother's people. Modern DNA proves what survivors testified. In regions once ruled by Tatars, the Y chromosomes of native men nearly vanished, replaced almost entirely by Mongol bloodlines. An entire people was erased, their genetic future overwritten. For Genghis Khan, this was victory. Not just over an enemy tribe, but over memory itself. The Tatars were no longer Tatars, they had been consumed. Every time a Mongol army took a city, the soldiers knew what came next. Not looting, not feasting, something far darker. They called it the selection. Women and girls were driven into central squares, stripped of jewelry, clothes, and dignity. Naked, they stood in rosy sometimes under blistering sun, sometimes in the freezing snow, while Mongol officials circled them like merchants at a livestock market. But this was no chaotic plundering. It was a system, a machine, a science of humiliation. First came the age test. Girls under 7 were usually killed too young to be useful, too costly to raise. Women over 40 often met the same fate, unless they possessed rare skills like medicine or craftsmanship. The prime range was set coldly, between 8 and 30-5. Then came the inspections: clear skin, straight teeth, symmetrical features. The officials checked for disease, for pregnancy, for signs of labor. Virgins carried the highest value, inspected in invasive, degrading ways to prove their worth. It was dehumanization perfected. Every woman reduced to numbers on a scoring sheet. Above 90, destined for the Khan himself. 80s, gifts for generals and commanders. 70s, distributed to officers. 60s, given to common soldiers. Below 60, the worst fate assignment, to the military brothels, where endless days of servicing men meant certain death. One Persian chronicler described the selection at Samarkand: 40,000 women standing in the main square while Mongol officers worked through them methodically, scratching marks onto tablets as if cataloguing cattle. The process took 3 full days. When it was done, the rejected were herded outside the city walls. The screams that followed told their fate. Mothers were torn from daughters, sisters forced to compete. For survival, women watched as others were chosen, and they were cast aside. The arbitrariness was deliberate, designed to break hope, to make survival feel like privilege even when it meant slavery. But among these parades of despair, one girl stood out. She was 17, a Tangut princess named Gerbil. Her beauty was haunting. Even as she tried to smear her face with dirt and disguise herself in plainness, she failed. The evaluator circled her like a vulture, eyes lingering, stylus scratching. On the board, he wrote a number, 98, nearly perfect. That single number sealed her fate. Gerbil would be sent to the Khan himself, a jewel in his vast collection of thousands. She watched as her sisters were dragged into soldiers' tents, as her mother screamed among the rejected care, and yet, she survived, if survival could be called this. Gerbil entered the Khan's personal harem, one of thousands, sorted by ethnicity and beauty, trophies of conquest. Chinese, Persian, Russian. Tangut displayed like a living map of Genghis's empire. But survival had given Gerbil something else. Something dangerous, a chance. Because while the other women wept, Gerbil memorized every detail: the guards' routines, the rhythms of the camp, the moments when Genghis Khan was weakest. She had been marked as perfect for him, but in time, she would prove perfect for something far greater. Her blade would balance the scales. The Mongol Empire wasn't just built on horses and arrows, it was built on systems, on infrastructure, on organization so precise it stretched across continents. And within that machinery of conquest, women became another resource tracked, transported, consumed. At the heart of this machine was the Yam System-R network of postal way stations that allowed Mongol couriers to race messages from Korea to Eastern Europe. Fresh horses, hot food, and shelter awaited every rider. But there was a fourth service, carefully hidden in the records. At every major station, there were women. Chinese scribes called them comfort houses. Neat rows of dormitories, separate quarters for guards, and administrative offices where clerks kept ledgers of inventory. Not horses or grain, but human beings. Each woman was logged with chilling precision. Her age, her origin, her health condition, whether she was pregnant. Soldiers presented tokens to claim their rights. Rank determined access. A general could take the most prized captives. A common soldier received whoever remained. Payment was unnecessary, was a state-funded service, maintained with imperial resources. Women were rotated between stations like livestock, moved in wagons that served as mobile prisons. The rotations weren't random. A Russian captive might be sent to Mongolia. A Mongolian woman might be displaced to Persia. The goal was deliberate: break culture, break language, break every possibility of solidarity. The ledgers tell the story in numbers too cruel to comprehend. Conservative estimates suggest 50,000 women trapped in this system at its peak. And that's only the documented ones. Temporary camps and unrecorded comfort houses multiplied the number far higher. Medical staff were provided not from compassion, but efficiency. Women were treated just enough to keep them alive for continued use. Those who became pregnant were separated into special camps. Their children marked and raised for the empire. Boys destined for military training. Girls groomed to replace their mothers in the system. Generational slavery institutionalized. The Mongols even created an audit system. Inspectors traveled from station to station, ensuring quotas were met. Too many deaths led to investigations. Too few services suggested inefficiency. Manuals were written, teaching station masters how to maximize use while minimizing waste. Bureaucracy, enabling atrocity. Some stations specialized. One near Karakoram kept only virgins for visiting dignitaries. Another in Persia housed women exclusively in the late stages of pregnancy. A third in China trained young girls to prepare them for service. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't lust. This was industrialized, rape managed with the same administrative genius that built the Mongol postal network. Even transportation reflected the cruelty. Women were chained together in wagons, given little food, no privacy. Many died along the routes. Caravan guards recorded their deaths like spoiled merchandise, noting them in ledgers as losses. Parents in conquered villages knew what the quotas meant. Failure to provide daughters for the system invited collective punishment. Fields, slaughtered families, entire villages erased. And so fathers gave up their children. Mothers kissed their daughters goodbye, hoping death would come quickly. The Mongols had turned women into another flow of empire, no different from taxes, tribute, or cattle. A commodity to be distributed, consumed, and replaced. And at the center of it all was Genghis Khan's personal collections, 15,000 women, organized by rank and ethnicity. A living map of conquest, flesh arranged like trophies, each woman a testament to the scale of his empire's cruelty. The same system that carried messages across continents carried broken lives. The same infrastructure that made the Mongols invincible on the battlefield made them history's most efficient machine of sexual slavery. It was conquest, not just of land or people but of the human soul. The Mongols did not know the word genetics, but they understood bloodlines. They understood that children carried the faces of their fathers, that heritage flowed through seed, and they turned that knowledge into a weapon. For Genghis Khan, conquest wasn't finished when a city's walls fell. It wasn't complete when its men were dead. True victory came when its women carried Mongol children. Every womb became a battlefield. Every child born from a conquered mother was a victory, etched in blood. The logic was horrifyingly simple. One Mongol soldier could impregnate dozens of women. In a single year, multiply that by hundreds of thousands of warriors over decades of expansion. Add to it the thousands of women held exclusively for nobles and the Khan himself. The result? A demographic tidal wave. Entire populations erased. Entire bloodlines replaced. The empire even built an infrastructure around it. Pregnant women were placed in guarded camps, fed and monitored not out of mercy, but to ensure healthy offspring. Miscarriages were investigated like crimes. Some women were punished for losing what the state now considered its property. Children of rape were catalogued, trained, and absorbed into the empire. Boys with strength were raised as Mongol warriors. Girls were kept for future distribution, continuing the cycle. A system of breeding, cold and deliberate. Stretching across 2 continents. The Mongols had a phrase for it. Watering foreign fields with Mongol rain. But forced pregnancy was more than numbers. It was psychological warfare through biology. A permanent reminder of conquest. Women who bore Mongol children could never return to their communities. Their sons and daughters carried the enemy's blood. To Mongol for their mother's people. To native for the Mongols. Belonging nowhere, yet serving the empire. In some regions, the genetic transformation was total. Pre-Mongol Y chromosomes, the markers of local men, virtually vanished. Science today confirms it. Modern DNA shows that 1 in every 200 men alive carries the genetic signature of Genghis Khan and his direct descendants. In certain parts of Asia, that number climbs to nearly 1 in 3, 16 million living men. 16 million pieces of evidence. Each one a reminder of systematic rape, weaponized as policy. But the Mongols knew the power of hierarchy too. Children of Mongol fathers often received privileges, access to education, administration, opportunities denied to their mother's people. For some women, this created a terrible choice. To resist meant death. To submit meant survival for their children. The empire exploited this, turning maternal instinct into another weapon of control. Even lactation was regulated. Women were forced to nurse their conquerors' children, binding them to the very lives that symbolized their humiliation. Those who refused faced torture or death. And yet, resistance never died. Some women sought secret abortions with herbs, whispered about in darkness. Others killed their newborns, disguising it as accident. Still others chose suicide, carrying their unborn children into death with them. The Mongols responded with collective punishment whole. Families executed for a single act of defiance. The result was exactly what Genghis Khan intended. An empire not just of land and cities, but of blood. His soldiers carried arrows and fire into the world, but their greatest weapon was invisible, passed down in silence. Hidden inside the body, centuries later, that weapon still echoes. 16 million men alive today carry his Y chromosome. Proof that conquest was not only written in chronicles and ruins, but in human flesh itself. For the Mongols, the womb was the final frontier of war. And in that frontier, they won. The year was 1223. The Oyat Confederation had dared to resist the Mongol advance. And for that defiance, Genghis Khan planned a punishment so severe that it would echo across generations. His soldiers moved with precision, sweeping through villages, tearing daughters from their mothers' arms. It took 3 days to collect them all. 4,000 girls. The youngest only 7. The oldest barely 15. They were herded to the capital square of Kyalik. Parents, brothers, and elders were forced to watch as the children were lined up, in neat rows, their small bodies trembling under the open sky. The Khan himself stood before the assembled crowd. Through translators, he delivered his decree. Your men will die knowing their bloodlines end. Your women will watch their daughters destroyed. Your children will serve those who destroyed them. And then, the horror began. Platforms had been built so that no eye could look away. Soldiers rotated in shifts, taking the girls publicly, methodically, deliberately. This was not drunken chaos. This was punishment as performance. The screams of thousands rose into the air, mingling with the laughter of their captors and the sobs of their families. Parents tried to reach their daughters. They were cut down where they stood. Others were forced to kneel at sword point, their faces turned toward the platforms so they could not look away. The Mongols had weaponized love, itself forcing families to witness what no parent should ever see. By dawn, the atrocity had only begun. It stretched on for days, organized in shifts, managed with infrastructure holding areas, guard rotations. Even food brought for the soldiers so they could continue without pause. The empire had turned rape into a public ritual of annihilation. 2 of the children died during the assault. Their broken bodies were displayed in front of the crowd as a message. This is mercy. Only 2 deaths out of 4,000. Survival, the Mongols claimed, was proof of restraint. But survival was another kind of torture. After the spectacle ended, the girls were distributed according to standard practice, scored, ranked, and assigned. Yet they carried a special designation. Daughters of Oyat rebels. It was a mark of shame that followed them wherever they were sent. Soldiers and generals made sure these girls suffered more harshly than others. Their origin used against them like a curse. The youngest captives, too small to be used, were kept in storage until they grew into service. They were raised inside slavery, knowing nothing else, their childhoods devoured before they even began. The Oyat people never recovered. Their population collapsed. Their culture scattered. The atrocity had achieved its purpose, not just to destroy, but to make resistance unthinkable. Across the steppes, word spread when the Mongols threatened to unleash the fate of the 4,000. Cities surrendered without a fight. The screams of those children had become a weapon sharper than any sword. The Oyat atrocity was more than a massacre. It was a lesson, a warning, a symbol burned into the memory of nations. 4,000 girls reduced to a single phrase, whispered in terror for centuries to come. Remember the 4,000. The Mongols were not content with brutality. They perfected it. What began as vengeance and domination evolved into something more terrifying, a science of suffering. Each campaign became a laboratory, every atrocity an experiment, and over time, the Mongols refined sexual violence into a weapon as deliberate as their bows and arrows. They learned about timing. Assault immediately after a city's fall broke resistance with shock. Delayed assaults waiting days while fear fermented multiplied terror even more. Fear itself became a tool, stretched and twisted until victims collapsed before a hand was ever laid on them. They learned about psychological cruelty. Women were forced to blaspheme their gods during assaults, to curse the divine and praise Genghis Khan. Temples became stages for desecration. Spiritual violation layered atop physical horror. They learned about sensory assault. Victims kept in darkness for days, then dragged into blinding light for humiliation. Others were surrounded by constant noise, the screams of fellow captives, the chants of Mongol war songs until even silence became unbearable. They learned about climate as torture. Naked women left in freezing snow between violations. Others, burned by desert heat, dehydrated, until their suffering reached new extremes. The environment itself became a weapon. They even used animals, warhorses trained to terrify, dogs unleashed as tools of control. Fear was primal, and the Mongols knew how to summon it. But their cruelties reached deeper still into the very fabric of family. Fathers were forced to choose which daughter would be raped first. Mothers forced to decide which child would live, which would die. Every choice led to horror. They built architecture of impossible decisions, stripping away even the comfort of sacrifice. And when resistance arose, they crushed it with symbolic mutilation. Women who killed their rapists, children were punished through mirrored tortures, their bodies carved into warnings for all. Victims were mutilated in ways designed not just to kill, but to communicate. A body left in the street was a message. This is what resistance earns you. The Mongols documented everything. Manuals were created, detailing methods, sequences, and results. Techniques passed from veteran to recruit like military drills. This was torture standardized, brutality bureaucratized. Even healing was weaponized. Mongol doctors tended to victims, not from compassion, but to preserve them for further use. Wounds stitched only to be torn open again. Medicine turned into an extension of violation, and at the heart of this machinery of cruelty was a paradox. The more the Mongols refined their methods, the more vulnerable they became. Because for every woman broken, there was one who endured. For every girl enslaved, one who sharpened her hate. And among them was a Tangut princess. Her name was Gerbil. She had watched her family murdered, her city burned, her body made property. But within her, something hardened. She had memorized the rhythms of cruelty, the patterns of guards, the weaknesses of the Khan. The Mongols believed they had perfected fear. What they had really perfected was the making of assassins. She was only 16 when the Mongols came. A princess of Tangut blood, daughter of an emperor. Her world shattered as Genghis Khan's armies surrounded her city. From the palace walls, Gerbil watched everything she loved die. Her brothers executed, their heads mounted on spears. Her mother leaping from a tower rather than face capture. Her city burning, its screams rising into the night. Gerbil tried to follow her mother, but Mongol hands dragged her back from the edge. She was spared for a purpose far worse. At the selection, her royal blood and extraordinary beauty sealed her fate. The evaluator circled her, stylus scratching against wood, before marking the number, 98. Nearly perfect, destined for Genghis Khan himself. For 3 years, she lived as one of his concubines, one of thousands inside his silk prisons. She was no longer a princess, no longer a daughter, no longer anything but a trophy in his vast collection. But she did not break. She memorized everything. The rhythm of the guards shifts. The nights when the Khan drank too heavily, the way he wheezed in his sleep. His body old and failing. The searchers thorough at the gates. Careless in the women's quarters, she learned the language, just enough to obey, never enough to seem dangerous. She smiled when expected. She bent her head in silence. She became invisible furniture in his tent. But inside, she carried fire. And then, one night, a weapon. An older concubine slipped it to her during bathing. A thin dagger, sharp enough for one strike. No words were exchanged, only a glance, a silent passing of defiance from one prisoner to another. Gerbil hid the blade in her hair, practiced the movement in the dark until her body knew it by memory. She waited. The chance came during a thunderstorm. The Khan, already weakened by illness, had drunk too much fermented mare's milk. He called for her specifically. Guards were distracted by the storm. Their watch, careless. Gerbil's hands trembled as she entered his tent, but the thunder masked her breath. The incense was heavy, the air suffocating. On silk cushions lay the man who had destroyed her world. His eyes glazed, his hand gesturing for her to come closer. She lowered herself beside him. Her fingers slipped into her hair. The blade slid free. For Tangut, she whispered in perfect Mongolian. And then she struck. The great Khan gasped, not in pleasure as he expected, but in shock. His hands clutched at his groin, blood spreading black across silk sheets. The man who had weaponized sexual terror, who had claimed thousands of women, now felt violation himself. Gerbil did not flee immediately. For 3 heartbeats, she watched him. His eyes shifted from confusion, to realization, to terror. The god of conquest, undone by a girl he thought powerless. Every daughter stolen, every mother broken, they send their regards through me. She whispered, then she moved. The storm covered her escape as she slipped past the guards. Women in the tents saw her blood-stained clothes, and though none spoke, they understood. Some wept, Some bowed their heads, all remained silent. Ran until she reached the river cliffs. The waters churned, swollen by storm. She did not hesitate. She had fulfilled her purpose. The only reason she had endured. For my mother, for Tangut, for all of them, she whispered to the storm before leaping. The river swallowed her, carrying her body miles downstream. The Mongols found her days later. They burned her without ceremony, denying her even a name in their records. But they could not erase what she had done in that tent. On that storm-filled night of 1227, the world's greatest conqueror bled out in silence, killed not by rival generals, not by an army, but by a teenage girl with nothing left to lose. And though the empire would endure, something fundamental had broken. The women whispered her story through the camps, across the brothels, through the stations of slavery. A legend was born. The princess who killed the monster. The official records lied, they claimed. Genghis Khan died of illness. Others whispered of a hunting accident, or old war wounds that never healed. But in the shadows of his empire, among the silken prisons of stolen women, the truth was passed in whispers. He was killed by a girl, a princess, a slave who became an assassin. Goebbels' body was burned without name, her story buried under official fictions. Yet stories are harder to kill than men. Through the harem tents, through the postal stations, through the military brothels, the legend spread. The Khan had died not in glory, but in humiliation. His empire had been shaken by the very weapon he had used to dominate others. For every woman he had broken, Goebbels became a symbol. Proof that even absolute power could bleed. Proof that even the greatest terror could be undone by a single hand, with a blade and nothing left to lose. But while her act ended one man, it could not erase the scars he left behind. 8 centuries later, those scars still shape cultures in Central Asia. Entire societies rebuilt themselves around the memory of Mongol terror. Purdah women hidden from sight, kept away not only from strangers but sometimes from their own families. The logic was simple: if invaders came again, hidden, women might survive. Architecture: homes, designed with hidden rooms, false walls, escape tunnels. Cities planned with women's quarters buried deep at the center, layered with defenses. Marriage customs: girls wed younger and younger. Families reasoning that a husband's household offered protection. Childhood ended at the first sign of womanhood. Honor killings and virginity rituals: better death than dishonor. Traditions born not from faith alone, but from trauma that made purity a shield against another Mongol-style catastrophe. Language itself changed. In some cultures, words for rape disappeared, replaced by euphemisms. The unspeakable literally became unspeakable. The Mongols had militarized sexuality so effectively that generations lived in its shadow. Parents told their children bedtime stories not of monsters or demons, but of conquerors who came for women first. Fear became inheritance. Even DNA carries the legacy. 16 million living men still bear the Y chromosome of Genghis Khan and his direct male line. Each one is a living reminder of systematic violation turned into empire policy. The human genome itself was rewritten by terror. But the greatest irony lies in the Khan's death. For decades, he had used women as tools, as weapons, as trophies. He believed himself untouchable, a god among men. And yet, in the end, it was a woman, one of his victims, who destroyed him. Princess Gerbil's blade did more than end a life. It shattered the illusion of invulnerability. It proved that every victim carried within them the possibility of vengeance. That every woman he enslaved was also a potential assassin. The empire staggered on after him, but something fundamental had changed. Fear, the very engine of his power, now cut both ways. The Mongol sexual terror remains history's darkest chapter. A reminder of how one man's private wound metastasized into a nightmare that scarred continents. But it also left behind a story of defiance, a girl who turned victimhood into a weapon, who showed that even the mightiest empire can fall to the hand of a single survivor. The storm has long passed. The river long carried her away. But her whisper still echoes through history.